women telling stories. Let's take the example of Ramayana. It's a text which has had considerable influence over our subcontinent. With over 300 regional variations, people have attempted to rewrite it, retell it, and re-narrativize it again and again. And one such version is written by Chandravati, mostly called Chandravati's Ramayana. The interesting part about Chandravati's Ramayana is that it goes away from the way Ramayana has always been written or viewed as. But the second interesting part about it is that Chandravati's Ramayana is also one that has been dismissed by literary critics to be incomplete or even considered to be her worst work. But I'll come back to what this criticism is, right? But before that, what does Chandravati write about? Chandravati recreates the Ramayana, but this time from a feminine sensibility. With her voice as a voice of dissent, and with Sita's voice voicing a feminine sensibility of vulnerability, of sadness, of emotion. And she talks about how Sita is impacted by all occurrences happening inside the story. It's different, mostly because it does not speak of Ram's glory. It's a version of Ramayana where Ram isn't at the center stage. Men are still present in this version. They still exist. However, they exist in contrast to women. But we are used to this, right? When women have always existed in epics, in stories, in contrast to men, why is it that men existing in contrast to women becomes so peculiar? And thus, perhaps it is, and has been considered to be incomplete or deprived of the nuances a Ramayana is required to have, thus discarded by literary critics. I don't have a problem with criticism as such, but my problem arises with the nature of this criticism, because it's almost a criticism on her agency to retell the story. Can women tell stories for themselves that probably they have grown up hearing? Ramayana as a story might be something a lot of us are familiar with, a lot of us have opinions on, a lot of us want to talk about. And thus, because of the influence it brings, we want to also put in our influence. When critics decide to assent or dissent to it, they also hold with themselves the power to represent. And thus, Chandravati's Ramayana is a version of Ramayana which is usually not considered to be taken into account when we talk about feminist texts, when we talk about different versions of the Ramayana even, because it's a text that had to be excavated to be found. It wasn't something that was given to any of us on a silver platter. Thus, the role that critics play in this representation is also of great importance. How does one decide if a woman telling a story is worth being endorsed or not? But another version of Ramayana that brings great interest is Mola's version of the Ramayana, a Telugu woman who talks about Ramayana in the dominant narrative, the version of the Ramayana which talks about Ram's glory, right? But this version of the Ramayana, even though dominant and popularized, is not a version that is taken into account when we talk about feminist texts or feminist perspectives or feminist literature emerging from India. And then I start wondering, what is it that actually makes literature feminist? Because Chandravati's Ramayana is one that is considered incomplete and is not taken into account when we discuss feminist literature, but even Mola's version isn't. Well, I think when we think of feminist literature, I think our thought inevitably goes back to what protest looks like, what dissent looks like. And thus Chandravati has dissented, perhaps in ways that we are not even ready to listen to, where the society is not even prepared to confront their own biases, right? And thus we dismiss it. I think that is what makes Chandravati's text feminist, right? She writes against social narratives. She makes us question, perhaps questions we don't even want to ask ourselves. She makes us question whether we should or shouldn't add women in stories like they've already been talked about. She makes us question what role women play in our stories. She makes us question what role women play in the society. And she also makes us question what we think of when we think of God, when we think of godly, when we think of the morality that comes from devotion. And we don't take these texts into account. We consider them to be incomplete, even though I would probably propose that these are texts which propose a bigger picture, a more wholesome or holistic picture of what our society looks like, right? Mola's text, on the other hand, even if it establishes and goes to what the dominant narrative looks like, where she does sing praises of Ram, where she does talk about Ram, I don't think the text is absent of feminism. And I'll explain why. Her text in itself is writing as a tool by a woman. A lower caste woman is an act of protest. She is doing something which already disaligns with what patriarchy wants you to do, what the society wants you to do. She also chooses to not adhere to the Brahminical notions of what structure in literature looks like. She creates her own form of poetic literature, a poetic version of the Ramayana, which may not even be as pervasive as at the time when it was written. But it's a text which is extremely popularized even till date in her region. And I think both of these things then become aspects of feminist literature, right? When we view feminist literature to be something which is an act of protest, but it's also an assertion of I am. Not every feminist text has to be a systematic inquiry into patriarchy. Mola just existing and writing and saying that look, in a world that is dominated by men, in a sphere of literature which is also dominated by men, this is what I propose, and also goes on to win great popularity. It's feminist. When we think of feminist literature in India, a few examples that mostly dominantly come to our mind are Begum Ruqayya Husain's Sultana's Dream. We think about Tarabai Shinde's Stri Purush Tulna, and we probably take names like Tagore and we take names like Premchand. And these are great texts, these are great pieces of literature that one should definitely read to be further able to empathize with the conditions that women have been subjected to in society. But it also makes us question if this is the extent of feminist literature that India has to propose from those times. A lot of literature written by women remains unearthed. Just like Chandrabati's Ramayana, it has been dismissed, it has been discarded, mostly because of its nature of being protesting, because of its nature of being something which is wanting to make us question or dissent. And thus these texts lie unrealized, these texts lie unrepresented, because even when they come at the center table, they're removed much before a discourse can actually happen around these texts. And it makes us question, where does feminist literature, or what is the scope of feminist literature in India when we look back at what literature has actually been proposed? For a lot of people, a lot of scholars make a claim that feminist literature in India is a sphere dominated by male writers like Tagore and Premchand. And I think that is where the disagreement comes, right? Because the simple act of writing by women can also be feminist. A literature which proposes the idea of I am, which says that look, you don't want me to exist. You don't want me to exist without you. But now here's a story where I am probably the main character. This is a story where I write about what I want to write about. I think that in itself, that assertion of I am and I exist without being in contrast to you, can be feminist. And therefore, we need to look again at everything we have read. And perhaps we have to start looking for texts which have been unrealized. We have to create a thorough excavation of our own. What is feminist literature, right? And I'll conclude by a few lines that are translated from a folk song. She goes a few steps, Sita, and looks back a few times. the palace of sinner Ram still rises high. Many versions of the Ramayana, written by women, which have feminine narratives echoing throughout them, are not as popular, they're not as dominant, but they exist in crevices in our society. And it's important we look inside these crevices. We find these stories, not just of the Ramayana, but I take that as an example, but we look for these stories and we come back. Because it is important that we represent these women in our conversations about literature, in our conversations about feminist literature, because by representing them, we represent a section of society that has been ignored for too long. And thus, I want all of us to look again at how we view feminist literature to be.